Hello and welcome to Infinity. I'm Charlie Seraph, and for the next half hour we're going to be talking about Zenoglossy. Our guest will define the term for you in a minute, if you're not familiar with it, and you probably aren't. He is Bill Kautz, staff scientist at SRI International and founder and director of the Research Center for Applied Intuition in San Francisco. Dr. Kautz has a Ph.D. in electrical engineering. Zenoglossy, Z-E-N-O, glossy, G-L-O-S-S-Y. What is it?
Zenoglossy, Charlie, is something like speaking in tongues, or glossolalia as it's properly called. This is the phenomenon in which individuals, often in a religious setting, will suddenly and spontaneously start speaking what appears to be a foreign language. Nobody knows exactly how it works, although it had a very ancient origin, but it's recently becoming the subject of study by psychologists, parapsychologists, and linguists.
How often has this occurred through recorded history?
It's hard to know because of the lack of actual recordings of it. It's quite common nowadays in Pentecostal churches for this to happen. The earliest record of it goes back to the book of Acts in the Bible, when at the time of Pentecost it was stated that individuals were speaking in tongues that they did not know and were hearing in languages that they did not know. And there are fragmentary records of Zenoglossy occurring, and glossolalia occurring throughout history from that time to the present.
What is the case that you're studying, and why did you choose it over other potential cases of study?
This so-called Rosemary case that we're studying is really a remarkable one. It occurred back in the 30s, around over a 25-year period, with a British, we called her a medium, whose pseudonym was Rosemary. Working in conjunction with a doctor of music, an organist in Blackpool, England, she suddenly, in the midst of her mediumistic or trance pronouncements, normally in English, started speaking this foreign language. Over a period of time, it gradually revealed itself as a vocal version of the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphic language. Now, this language has no vowels in it in the written form, and yet she was speaking this language as if it was her native tongue. So this was truly a remarkable situation.
What kinds of, are there recordings from the 30s of her speaking?
Well, they didn't have tape recorders at that time, but Dr. Wood, being a musician, had a very good ear, and he invented his own phonetic script and took down everything that Rosemary said. He's got a total of 8,000 document pages of her utterings, and that includes about 5,000 phrases and sentences in this language that's purported to be ancient Egyptian.
Did Rosemary understand what she was saying?
Sometimes she did, though often she didn't. About 10% of the sentences were followed by English translations, rather loose ones, but at least the content was there. And sometimes she would be sort of half awake and half in trance, and other times she'd be completely out. So there was only partial understanding, but she certainly understood the context of what she was saying. She was feeling like she was indeed an ancient Egyptian in the court life of around the 18th dynasty, which is around 1370 to 1390 BC.
Was she able to respond to questions that were posed to her in Egyptian?
Absolutely. There was an amateur Egyptologist working with Dr. Wood at that time, Howard Hulme, who managed to formulate questions based on the vocabulary that she had generated, and they were able to carry on some kind of a dialogue at that time. But more commonly, Dr. Wood himself would phrase questions in English, which she would often answer in Egyptian.
Was she able to do this when she was not in the trance-like state?
No, she was not.
Did she have any recollection of what if they had a conversation when she became conscious again, did she recall what they had talked about?
Yes, the subject matter certainly, though she did not have a recollection of the actual words that were used.
What are some of the approaches that were taken at that time and since to try to find the loophole or find a way around it or some sort of explanation of it? Did she used to live next door to some Egyptians as a young girl or something like that.
Well, a fair amount is known about her background, and of course living next to Egyptians wouldn't help because this language was last spoken about 300 AD, and even at that time it was quite a different dialect and different form. It's one of the remarkable aspects of this case because it shows somehow that something at this very ancient time has survived to this day, quite apart from paper records, because of course there are no paper records of the vowel sounds in Egyptian. So that's one of the most remarkable aspects of this case. I should mention that there are other cases of xenoglossy on record, a few recent and very notable ones that have been studied by Dr. Ian Stevenson of the University of Virginia, a renowned parapsychologist. These involve the use of the speaking of German and Swedish, respectively. And in both cases, a dialogue could be carried on between the subject and himself. But there's always the question in such cases, did this person learn this language in childhood? And it's a very difficult thing to prove that a person did not learn a language or was exposed to it.
What kinds of things did she talk about? Back to Rosemary.
She talked mainly about the life at that time in ancient Egypt from the point of view of someone who was attached to the court. Though there was a great deal about the life of the common people, what they talked about, what they did in the marketplace, how they raised their children, the kinds of personalities they had. Very valuable information if it's true, because this is not the sort of thing that's recorded on the walls of tombs or on obelisks. She also talked a great deal about the politics of the time, international affairs, the foreign elements in her culture, the religious life of the people, the agriculture of the time. There's a great deal of information about intimate information and detailed information about life in ancient Egypt.
Were there elements of her recollections that don't jibe with what we presume to be the history of that time?
There are a number of these, yes, but your word presume is well taken, because if one looks into the picture of life in ancient Egypt that has been painted by the archaeologists and Egyptologists, you find that there's really a great deal of speculation there, as is often the case in archaeology, in which from a few fragments of a pot or writings on a wall, a great deal is built up, which is to a large extent the figment of the scientist's imagination.
Is the fact that this Rosemary is no longer alive, has it compounded the difficulty of researching the topic?
I don't think so. She left behind her such a grand legacy of documented speech that we have plenty to work with. This has now been obtained from England. It's been entered into a computer, and we are now in the process of actually performing a proper translation of it that will have evidential value from a scientific point of view.
Is there any attempt, since he was a musician and a musical person, of recreating in sound the sounds that she uttered as they were written down? Did he write them down as notes in any?
Well, to write down the speech sounds as notes doesn't make too much difference. Too much sense, but he did write down several pieces of music that she sang to him. For example, I remember one instance where there was a song of the boatmen pulling boats along the Nile, and there were also temple rituals that she described in quite some detail, of the dances and the girls carrying candles and so forth, and some of the chanting and songs that went with this.
What about the again, thinking in a musical framework, music is often associated with some sort of worship in the religious customs of the time. Was there an element of that?
Yes, there was quite a bit of element of that. In fact, she brought in the religious life of the people rather strongly here, and setting it in opposition to the rather sterile descriptions of the religious life of the people that have come from the Egyptologists.
For example, what do the Egyptologists say as opposed to what we're given in these accounts?
Well, it's a little hard to describe briefly, but I might put it this way, that the Egyptologists have described ancient Egyptian religion pretty much in the terms of Western religion, which of course they were more familiar with. But as Rosemary described it, there were many subtleties and really quite a different point of view about where man came from and man's relationship to the creative forces that the Egyptologists have missed completely. So that's a very interesting and powerful side of the Rosemary case.
You mentioned early on speaking in tongues, which is the Pentecostal experience. Is that the beginning and the ending of Zenoglossy, or are there elements that separate the research and the study that you're doing from what we commonly refer to as speaking in tongues?
They're quite separate. Speaking in tongues, though the result of that process may sound like a foreign language to a naive listener, it very likely is not. And this has been determined through a number of studies which have looked at the frequency distribution of the different sounds that come from glossolalia, or speaking in tongues. And these are distinctly different from ordinary speech, even for languages, primitive languages that we happen to know. So it's kind of a verbal jazz. It's a letting go of the speech centers by the conscious mind, so that the semantic content, the meaning content, is removed, but the speech centers are allowed to kind of free run and just generate sound sequences on their own. But it's a long way apart from the the kinds of languages that we know. Zenoglossy, on the other hand, is a real foreign language that a speaker of that language would recognize.
In Rosemary's day, how was the case received, and how long, you mentioned, I think, 25 years that this went on with her, that she participated in the research?
Yes. Dr. Wood reported on this to a number of different circles, both the group of psychic researchers at that time, where it was well received and with much interest, to the Egyptologists, where he got exactly the opposite reaction. They, of course, it's not surprising that they were not open to this process at all, even to the point of looking at it carefully to see whether it might be of some use to them.
What was the time frame here again?
Well, back in the mid-20s to 1940, something like that.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. No, to 1950 something. Yeah,
okay.
About 25 to 30 years. Mm-hmm.
Well, during that time, recording techniques were improved. It seems unfortunate you don't have any recordings at all of any type of discs that were made, impressions that were made.
Well, actually, 2 gramophone records were made later on when this process was going on. And I do have a tape sample that's been made from one of these. However, they were played so many times improperly that they're almost unintelligible. You can hardly tell that it's a woman speaking, let alone that she's speaking Egyptian. So they're not of much use.
So on one, the people that were interested in the unexplained or unexplainable were interested in the research that the archaeologists said hogwash and would have none of it, which I guess is to be expected. Were there other people involved in the research?
I think only those 2 in a principal way, yes.
What does this study and Zenoglossy in general suggest about reincarnation, survival?
Well, let's speak to survival first, since
okay.
It's perhaps a more credible notion. This has been the subject of study by parapsychologists for some time, even going back into the last century with work done by the famous British workers in this area, Sir Oliver Lodge and others, Frederick Myers. They were trying to find some way of proving that something about human beings survived their bodily death. And they worked a lot with mediums and messages and so forth, but it's all based on just information coming through, which really could be explained as a psychic process apart from the notion of survival. So the evidence has never been really convincing. These Zenoglossy cases that have come up are perhaps the strongest evidence, because we're pulling in such highly detailed information often from many, many years back. And this case appears to be the strongest of those that have come along, of all the such cases that have come along.
Could it be, and there are a lot of, I suppose we could sit here and hypothesize all day, but could it be that Rosemary's distant ancestors were from Egypt, that she inherited the ability from them through some kind of a mutant genealogical process, and that things were recorded in her genes that she was able to later bring up?
Well, if genes can record this kind of detailed information, it's going far, far beyond what biology would ever try to claim. So we can't say, of course, with any definiteness what are the limits of gene records, but it seems extremely unlikely that anything like that could ever happen.
So where do we go? A ribbon of time that's somewhere in the cosmos that she reached out and was able to tap into these energies that had existed on the planet at a previous time and call them into a different time frame?
Well, the great psychologist Carl Jung has presented a model which actually shows up in most of the religions of the world, that there is among us a kind of collective unconscious, which is sort of a repository of human knowledge that really exists, and is accessible to people through their own unconscious minds, and that it's possible for information, this historical information and a great deal more, to leak through into the conscious mind in the case of certain people who open themselves up to this. And certainly we're getting manifold evidence of this process in many, many ways now, coming in experiences that people have through dreams, through various psychic phenomena, through not only trance mediums, but ordinary people who are able to carry out certain kinds of predictions or pick up knowledge from other people's minds or from history. So we're quite certain now that there is something like this, that there is some great repository of knowledge. Sometimes it's called the Book of God's Remembrance or the Akashic Records. There is some kind of a great data bank in the sky that we can draw on, and that is apparently where this information is coming from. But just because it's there doesn't mean it comes through easily, so it does take someone who has, let us say, some strong affinity with Egypt, and perhaps even some familiarity with the language itself, to serve as a channel for this to happen.
What is the specific goal of your research right now? I would guess the long-term goal would be to find that repository, wherever it is, the big data bank in the sky, and plug into it. But do you have a more immediate goal in reviewing this information?
Well, I have my main goal in doing this work is to bring to light the Rosemary work, her whole message, the full set of Rosemary records, not just the Egyptian, to bring that to light so that it may serve as a teaching to many, many people. However, to lend credibility to it, we really have to put this Egyptian matter to rest as to whether it really is valid Egyptian or not. And if it is, as we are almost certain of, then this will draw attention to the work, not only on the part of those who are scientists and might be very critical, but also by the general public. But the real purpose behind this is to bring out the spiritual message that lies behind all of this Egyptian, the life at that time, and the message that she gave in English that's filling up this 8,000 pages.
What do you do specifically in terms of the research? How do you conduct it, other than reviewing and reading 8,000 pages, which is a task in and of itself, but one that is completable, and you've read it and you study the material? What else do you do?
Mm-hmm. Well, the work that we've done with the language, after we get it onto tape and into a computer, is to utilize a small to medium-sized computer to do the actual translation. And this involves, it's not really translation for that matter, it's more like cryptography, or that is decoding messages. And because we don't have really adequate dictionaries of the language of that day, since none of them contain vowels. So it's a matter of bouncing back and forth between different sentences that contain the same words, and gradually, sentence by sentence, building up a a translation at the same time as a lexicon is built up. And that's the process we're involved in now. It requires a computer, because to do this by hand would involve so much paper shuffling with 5,000 different sentences and a growing lexicon which has many errors in it, since it's being developed slowly. It just would be impossible to do.
How are you doing right now?
Oh, we're doing pretty well. We're about, I guess, 15 to 20% into the database, and have that in pretty good shape.
I'm trying to imagine in my mind a woman in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s who all of a sudden one day figures out that she has some kind of a connection with something that she doesn't particularly understand, and people start relating to her that she talks to them in an ancient Egyptian dialect.
Mm-hmm.
How did it affect her life?
Well, of course, it came on slowly, so she was, some of this panic was alleviated with that. But she was basically a wonderful woman. Her life was devoted to service to others. She was a teacher in her normal life. So when these questions come up, they invariably get settled by, well, would this possibly be of value to the rest of the world? And with the encouragement of her partner in this effort, Dr. Wood, the answer came out a clear yes. So she gave her life over to that.
Are there people living, walking, breathing today that are undergoing a similar sort of process?
There certainly are, and I'm privileged to know quite a number of them. It isn't exactly coming through as Egyptian language, but they're going through similar transformations. It's like they are waking up out of a sleep and suddenly confronted with a new kind of experience or a new reality that is much broader than what they we're used to. And there are elements of excitement about this, and there are also some elements of fear, just because of unfamiliarity. But some of these people succumb to the fear and block the whole thing off, but most of them do not. They respond to the calling that is coming along with this, and give over at least a part of their lives to manifesting that kind of energy to the rest of the world.
Was Edgar Cayce one of those individuals?
He certainly was. Mm-hmm.
Do you think it's more difficult for someone in today, and I don't know, because I didn't live in the 1920s, and I don't really have a feel through the history and the Hollywood depictions of the era. And do you think it's more difficult for someone today because you have the National Enquirer and you have a lot of charlatans running around making all kinds of claims to all sorts of things, to come out and express themselves in this way? Is it more difficult today than it was in the 1920s for Rosemary?
I think it's much easier, actually. Sure that there are many false prophets, if you like, or charlatans, but there are many, many more who are very, very valid. And they don't make as big a noise, maybe, but they are certainly there. And anyone who has an openness and an interest in these things could very easily find them in our modern world where communications are so facile. There are books by the hundreds, as you surely know. These messages come across on the media, and it's just all around. There's a very popular interest in these kinds of subjects. More and more individuals are beginning to ask in a very serious way who they really are and what in the world they are doing here, and is there any sense to it, is there any purpose to it, and what part do they have to play in that purpose. And these questions are not mere philosophic questions for the scholars. They are very real, and they're for everybody to wrestle with. And what you're seeing today is in large part individuals who have wrestled with these questions and come out with strong positive answers that are very meaningful to them and thence to others to whom they teach.
What was the spiritual message that Rosemary received about the purpose of life?
Mm-hmm. It's hard to encapsulate this message in just a few words. Some of her material has been put into books, and these books are available. But the general message is that life is much, much bigger than most of us presume, particularly when we're growing up. Much, much bigger. That the essence of being a human being is not just having a body or even a brain, but the essence is a non-physical form of which the body and the brain are just surface manifestations, as our clothes are surface manifestations of our bodies. And that this higher essence or higher self is continuous. It exists outside of space and, for that matter, time, and just goes through a sequence of experiences. I use the word sequence a bit carelessly, because if this essence exists outside of time, then the notion of sequence is not really meaningful. But that's what we're all doing. We're going through a variety of sequences of different kinds of experiences in order to grow to a state of higher perfection. And that this happens through a process of continually acquiring a comprehension and a responsibility for a bigger and bigger piece of all that is. And we call it, in the vernacular of today, expanding consciousness, and that's really what it is. And every time there's a quantum of expansion of understanding who we are, there's lessons to be learned in actually dealing with that and manipulating it and integrating it into the rest of who we are, our concept of who we are. And it gradually gets bigger and bigger.
Does that suggest that there are a finite number of souls or spirits or beings, and that those beings continue to grow, but new spirits or new souls are not regenerated?
I don't know that it suggests that, because that's asking a question which is so far removed from our level of reality that I wouldn't know how to answer it.
How has it affected you personally to spend as much time as you have into taking thousands of pages and sitting down and doing some very tedious work, I would imagine? The computer takes a part of the load, but some of it is tedious, and yet you obviously are affected by the underlying spirituality of it all. Has it changed your life?
Well, it certainly has, though it is part of a bigger picture of which the Rosemary work, the thousands of hours of work on that, is only a part. It's just for me, a gradual recognition of who I really am, which is quite a bit different than who I thought I was 10 or 20 years ago, and learning to work in that world, and learning to function in it, learning to appreciate it, the beauty and the grandeur of it, and of course devoting a good part of my work to communicating that to others in one form or another.
Are these individuals that you are privileged to know that are experiencing similar things today, do they seem to be operating on the same spiritual plane? Is the message consistent, even though the language is different?
Yes, I'd say if it's not the same, it's very similar. We're sort of moving in the same space. I'm referring here to a team of expert intuitives who have learned to control this leak-through process from the collective unconscious into this reality, and they've learned how to do this very well and with high accuracy and reliability. So we're using them to solve various kinds of problems, social as well as technical, and this is a whole other sphere of work. But they're also playing a part in this Rosemary study.
This is Infinity. Remember to keep your mind open and listen to your heart. I'm Charlie Seraphin. Thank you for listening.